back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hi guys! So I'm here today to talk about a non-fiction book which I recently listened to on audiobook, and this is The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and the People's Temple, and it's written by Jeff Gwynne. I audiobooked this and I would definitely recommend doing that because I think the audiobook narrator, whose name I forget, I'll put it on the screen, was really good at narrating this book. It felt really real and exciting to me, even though it's a non-fiction factual book. So this follows the mass suicide and the events building up to the mass suicide of the people of People's Temple, who were basically the followers of Jim Jones. Jim Jones was a young boy who grew up in America. He was inspired by lots of different religions as he grew up, and he came from a fairly low background, not hugely academic or hugely wealthy, but he made something of himself quite early in life, and he decided that he wanted to go into preaching, and he met a lovely young woman who he married and ended up kind of living most of his life with. And together they started off this thing called the People's Temple that evolved and grew and changed over the years from something that started quite happy and healthy into something that became quite toxic and narcissistic in a way. I found this super fascinating because I had not really heard too much about the events that had happened or that had built up to this. I just heard about this mass suicide that happened in Ghana, and I was super intrigued. I suppose how indoctrinated you had to be to willingly commit an act like suicide en masse. So I was really intrigued about how Jim Jones himself got to that point where he would order people to do it, and also how he achieved the fame that he had and the people who followed him religiously and followed him across the world and also into death. So I was just fascinated by that. I find sort of darker, twisted non-fiction really interesting because I think it's really fascinating to see how far the human psyche will go and how really caught up in things people can get. And cults and religious movements really fascinate me. So this book was kind of perfect for that. What I did like was that it gave you a lot of background about this person of Jim Jones and what he went through in his life, and it didn't really try and fall down one side or the other. It didn't really say he was great or he wasn't. It talked a lot about the activities that he and the church started up, and they were probably a really good positive influence in the community and in people's lives when it first began. But of course, sometimes things go too far and the power seemed to get to his head, and that's when things started to go downhill and problems started to arise for not only him but the followers of the church, who started having nasty acts done to them and such. So it definitely was a bit of a downhill slide, and when one thing started going wrong, everything seemed to start going wrong. But I found it so interesting to follow the narrative of these events and to follow everything leading up to it and then the terrible, tragic ending of it all. Today there are still quite a few people who survived it, who were part of the church but just weren't there on the day, or who were related to people who were in the church and ended up killing themselves. It's definitely a controversial book. It's not something I'd recommend to everyone, and it's certainly something that I think if you are interested in cults and religious movements, you will probably enjoy. It seemed very well written to me and very easy and accessible to get into for a non-fiction, which is kind of exactly the sort I like. And I do think it's a fascinating subject, if very depressing in the end. Definitely one I would recommend thoroughly, and I'm intrigued by what else this author has written about, so I might go and look up some other things by him, but I would really be fascinated if you guys could recommend me some similar things. If you've ever heard the phrase "don't drink the Kool-Aid," that phrase comes from this event of mass suicide that happened because the people who did commit the suicide were told to drink cyanide, and it was mixed with something called Flavor Aid, but Flavor Aid is not overly memorable, and so when people heard about this disaster, it just became a kind of common known thing that people had to drink Kool-Aid incorrectly, and so the phrase became "don't drink the Kool-Aid." So yeah, I found that really interesting, that little nugget of nugget of information. But I really enjoyed this book. I'd highly recommend it. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars overall, so it's definitely a solid read, and I do think it's a fascinating one too. I'd love to have your recommendations for other similar topics down below, or let me know if you're planning to pick this one up. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon in my next video. Bye guys!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.